She smiled as the Duke chose his mistress. Hours later, the entire kingdom chose her instead.
The grand ballroom fell dead silent as the Duke clasped his family's most sacred heirloom around his mistress's neck. Everyone waited for his wife to crumble in humiliation. Instead, she smiled. A terrifying, serene smile, because she knew something he didn't. By midnight, he wouldn't just lose her. He would lose absolutely everything. The year was 1814, and London's high society was a vicious arena, disguised in silk, champagne, and polite smiles. At the very pinnacle of this glittering hierarchy stood the Wycliffe estate, hosting the much-anticipated summer solstice ball. Over 500 members of the peerage filled the grand gallery, the air thick with the scent of imported roses and the sharp, underlying tang of scandal. Lady Genevieve Montgomery, the Duchess of Wycliffe, stood at the top of the grand marble staircase, the undisputed queen of the evening. Born Genevieve Hemsley, the sole heiress to the wealthiest shipping and banking magnate in England, she possessed a fortune that rivaled the crown's. 5 years prior, her immense wealth had rescued the ancient but utterly bankrupt Montgomery family from debtors' prisons and absolute ruin. In exchange for her father's money, Alistair Montgomery, the fiercely proud and perilously handsome Duke of Wycliffe, had given her his title. It was a transaction forged in desperation, but Genevieve had, foolishly, hoped to build a partnership. Alistair, however, possessed the crippling arrogance of a man who despised owing his salvation to a woman. As the years passed, his bruised ego festered into outright cruelty. He flaunted his indiscretions, subtly chipping away at Genevieve's dignity, desperate to prove that while her money maintained the manor, he was still the master of it. But tonight, Alistair planned to elevate his petty cruelties into a spectacular execution of his wife's social standing. The orchestra's lilting waltz faded into a discordant halt as a collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. From the gallery archway emerged Alistair Montgomery, his chin tilted in defiance, dressed in immaculate dark velvet. Clinging tightly to his arm was Miss Clara Pembroke. Clara was a notoriously ambitious social climber, the daughter of a minor, impoverished viscount. She was undeniably beautiful, possessing the fragile, wide-eyed look that men like Alistair loved to fiercely protect. But it was not Clara's presence that caused dowagers to clutch their pearls and lords to step back in stunned silence. It was what rested upon her pale collarbone, the Wycliffe sapphire. A breathtaking, heavy pendant of flawless blue fire surrounded by crushed diamonds. The sapphire was a legendary heirloom. It had been presented by the king to the first Duchess of Wycliffe 2 centuries ago. Tradition dictated with ironclad severity that only the reigning duchess was permitted to wear it. Genevieve had worn it on her wedding day. Now, Alistair had deliberately taken it from the family vaults and draped it around the neck of his mistress, bringing her to his wife's own ball. Whispers erupted like a match thrown into dry hay. "Good God, he's actually done it," muttered Lord Harrington, leaning toward his wife. "He has publicly unseated the Duchess." "The cruelty of it," Lady Harrington whispered back, her eyes darting nervously up the staircase. "He means to drive her from the house tonight. He intends to install the Pembroke girl." All eyes shifted upward, seeking the wounded animal. They expected Genevieve to weep, to flee, to perhaps strike her husband in a dramatic fit of aristocratic hysteria. The society vultures held their breath, salivating for the breakdown of the untouchable Duchess. Genevieve stood perfectly still. The candlelight caught the intricate gold threading of her emerald silk gown. Her expression was unreadable. She looked at Alistair, whose eyes were locked onto hers with a triumphant, mocking gleam. He was waiting for her tears. He was practically begging for her to break, so he could play the part of the long-suffering nobleman shackled to an emotional, hysterical wife. Genevieve's gaze drifted to Clara, who offered a small, pitiable smirk, her hand rising to brush the priceless sapphire at her throat. Then, the impossible happened. Genevieve did not cry. She did not scream. Slowly, her lips curved upward. She smiled. It was not a forced, brave smile to mask a breaking heart. It was a genuine, terrifyingly serene smile. It was the smile of a grandmaster who had just watched her opponent foolishly move his king into a fatal trap. She raised her crystal glass of champagne in a silent, mocking toast toward her husband, took a delicate sip, and turned her back on him, descending the opposite side of the staircase to effortlessly mingle with the foreign ambassadors. Alistair's triumphant sneer faltered. A cold prickle of unease settled at the base of his neck. That smile. It lacked the devastation he required. Clara tugged at his sleeve, oblivious to the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Did you see her face, Alistair? She knows she is defeated. Alistair swallowed hard, forcing his arrogant posture back into place. Indeed, my dear. The house is finally mine. But as the night wore on, the whispers in the ballroom began to mutate. The societal elites were not mocking Genevieve's humiliation. They were deeply unsettled by her terrifying calm. Genevieve moved through the crowd with predatory grace, leaning in to whisper a few quiet words to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, sharing a soft laugh with the Lord Chief Justice, and placing a gentle, lingering hand on the shoulder of the Governor of the Bank of England. By the time the carriage horses were being called at 2 in the morning, Alistair had convinced himself that Genevieve's smile was merely the shock of a defeated woman. He retired to his study with a glass of brandy, reveling in his perceived victory. He had broken the Hemsley heiress. Tomorrow, he would demand she retire to the countryside, leaving him the London estate, her father's endless coffers, and the beautiful Clara. He had no idea that while he was pouring his second glass of brandy, his wife had not gone to sleep. Genevieve was stepping into a carriage, shrouded in the heavy London fog, carrying a leather dossier that contained the financial lifeblood of every single nobleman who had attended her ball. The Duke had chosen his mistress. But before the sun would rise over the Thames, the Duke was going to learn a brutal lesson about power. The fog rolling off the River Thames in the early hours of the morning was thick enough to swallow a carriage whole. Genevieve's unmarked black coach rattled over the cobblestones, moving swiftly away from the opulence of Mayfair and plunging into the heart of London's financial district. Inside the carriage, lit only by a swinging brass lantern, Genevieve sat entirely composed, the emerald silk of her ball gown hidden beneath a heavy midnight blue cloak. Across from her sat Lord Henry Fitzroy, a man whose unassuming appearance belied his immense power. Fitzroy was not merely a close confidant of her late father. He was the shadow governor of the vast Hemsley banking empire, a staggering web of wealth that held the promissory notes, mortgages, and gambling debts of nearly the entire House of Lords. He went further than I anticipated, Fitzroy murmured, adjusting his spectacles. The Wycliffe sapphire. It was a foolish, fatal error on his part. Genevieve, Alistair is a creature driven entirely by his own vanity. Henry, Genevieve replied, her voice as smooth and cold as polished marble. He believes that because I am a woman, I only inherited my father's money, not his mind. He thinks he conquered me by humiliating me in front of the very people whose lands we secretly own. She opened the leather dossier on her lap. Inside were documents that would rewrite the power structure of British society by breakfast. When my father negotiated the marriage settlements, Genevieve continued, tracing the heavy wax seals with a gloved finger. Alistair was too desperate and too arrogant to read the fine print. The Crown did not grant him immunity from his previous debts. My father simply bought them. Furthermore, the Wycliffe estates, the manor, the country houses, the farmlands were collateral. The moment Alistair committed a public act that fundamentally damaged the reputation of the Duchess, a morality clause was triggered, allowing the immediate calling in of all debts. Fitzroy offered a grim, satisfied smile, and parading his mistress in the family heirloom before 500 peers of the realm constitutes quite the public damage. Execute the Hemsley Protocol, Henry, Genevieve commanded softly. Every single nobleman who laughed tonight, every lord who thought Alistair had triumphed, holds a debt with us. Call in the interest. Freeze Alistair's accounts. I want the deed to Wycliffe Manor transferred to my name by dawn, and send a messenger to the Prince Regent's secretary. His Royal Highness owes us a considerable sum for that pleasure palace he is building in Brighton. Gently remind him that his continued funding relies on my absolute favor. By 8 a.m., the machinery of Genevieve's wrath was silently moving through London like a plague. Alistair Montgomery woke at 10 o'clock with a pounding headache and a supreme sense of satisfaction. He dressed leisurely, anticipating the moment he would summon Genevieve to his study to dictate the terms of her banishment to Yorkshire. He strolled down the grand corridor, passing portraits of his ancestors, feeling more like a duke than he had in 5 years. "Summon the Duchess," he snapped at a passing footman. The footman, a man who had served the estate for 20 years, did not bow. Instead, he looked at Alistair with a strange mixture of pity and contempt. "The Duchess is not in residence, Your Grace. She departed early this morning, and there is a gentleman waiting for you in the drawing room." Alistair frowned. "A gentleman? At this hour? Send him away." "I am afraid I cannot do that, Mr. Montgomery." Alistair froze. He turned slowly, staring at the servant. "Mr. Montgomery?" he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "You forget yourself. I am the Duke of Wycliffe. The title is yours to keep, sir." A dry, raspy voice echoed from the doorway of the drawing room. Alistair spun around to see a gray-haired solicitor flanked by 2 towering men in the dark uniforms of the King's Bench. The solicitor adjusted his glasses, looking at Alistair as if he were a particularly unpleasant insect. "However, the house is not," the solicitor continued. "Nor is the furniture, the horses, the silverware, or the very clothes upon your back, pending an audit of your colossal debts." "What is the meaning of this outrage?" Alistair roared, his face flushing crimson. He marched toward the men. "I am a peer of the realm. I demand you leave my property." "It is no longer your property," the solicitor replied smoothly, drawing a thick sheaf of legal parchment from his briefcase. "As of 6 o'clock this morning, the Bank of England, acting on behalf of the Hemsley estate, has called in all outstanding promissory notes signed by you. The total sum is £140,000. Since you cannot pay, the collateral, namely Wycliffe Manor and all unentailed Montgomery properties, has been seized by Lady Genevieve." Alistair felt the floor drop out from beneath him. A cold, suffocating panic gripped his chest. "Genevieve, she cannot do this. She is my wife. What is hers is mine by law." "Ah, but the original debts were incurred before your marriage, purchased by her late father, and placed in a blind trust," the solicitor corrected sharply. "A trust to which you have no legal access. You are a bankrupt man, Alistair. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate Lady Genevieve's premises. The men beside me will ensure you take nothing but the garments you wore prior to your marriage." "I will take this to the House of Lords," Alistair screamed, spittle flying from his lips, his aristocratic composure shattering entirely. "I have allies! I have friends!" Alistair turned on his heel and stormed out the front doors, not even waiting for a carriage. He practically ran through the streets of Mayfair, arriving breathless and manic at the doors of White's, the most exclusive gentlemen's club in London. This was his sanctuary, his stronghold, where the men who had clapped him on the back the night before would rally to his defense. He burst through the mahogany doors, his eyes wildly searching the reading room. He spotted Lord Harrington and the Earl of Sussex by the fireplace. "Harrington!" Alistair gasped, striding toward him. "You will not believe the treason my wife has attempted. I need a loan, immediately, and your support in the House to nullify a fraudulent contract." Lord Harrington looked up from his morning paper. His face was entirely devoid of warmth. Slowly, deliberately, Harrington set his newspaper down, stood up, and turned his back on Alistair. Alistair stopped dead in his tracks. He looked around the room. Dozens of the most powerful men in England were present. One by one, as Alistair's eyes met theirs, they looked away. Some shifted uncomfortably, others glared with outright hostility. The Earl of Sussex stepped forward, his voice cold enough to freeze wine. "Leave this club, Montgomery. Do not speak to me. Do not speak to anyone here." "Sussex, what madness is this?" Alistair pleaded, his arrogance finally cracking into genuine terror. "Last night you commended my bravery." "Last night," Sussex hissed, stepping intimately close so only Alistair could hear. "We did not know that your wife holds the mortgages to half the estates in this room." My banker arrived at my home at dawn. "Lady Genevieve has gently suggested that any man who associates with you will find his debts called in by noon." Sussex stepped back, looking Alistair up and down with profound disgust. "She is the bank, Alistair. The entire kingdom belongs to her. You are nothing." Alistair Montgomery stumbled out of White's club, the heavy mahogany doors shutting behind him with the finality of a coffin lid. The foggy London morning had given way to a brisk, unforgiving afternoon. He stood on James's Street, a man who had woken up as one of the most powerful peers in the British Empire, now reduced to a pariah with nothing but the tailored velvet coat on his back. His mind frantically scrambled for a lifeline. His friends had abandoned him. His properties were seized. There was only one place left to go. He practically ran the mile to Mayfair, dodging carriages and crossing sweeps, his aristocratic dignity entirely forgotten. He arrived at the elegant Georgian townhouse he had rented for Clara Pembroke. The lease, he suddenly realized with a sickening jolt, was paid through an account that was now undoubtedly frozen. Alistair banged his fists against the polished oak door until the butler, a stiff-lipped man named Higgins, finally opened it. Without waiting for an invitation, Alistair shoved past him and bounded up the stairs, calling out for his mistress. Clara was in the drawing room, sipping tea and perusing the society pages of the Morning Post, still basking in the glow of the previous night's triumph. She wore a delicate morning gown of pale pink muslin, and incredibly, the Wycliffe sapphire still rested heavily against her collarbone. She had refused to take it off, mesmerized by the sheer weight and value of the legendary jewel. "Alistair, darling," Clara beamed, setting her teacup down. "I have been waiting for you. Have you spoken to your wretched wife? Is she packing her trunks for Yorkshire?" Alistair collapsed onto a silk chaise lounge, burying his face in his trembling hands. "It is gone, Clara. All of it. The manor, the accounts, the estates. Genevieve. She owned my debts. She called them in. I am ruined." Clara's smile froze. The delicate porcelain teacup rattled against its saucer. "Ruined? What do you mean, ruined? You are a duke." "A duke with not a single guinea to his name," Alistair shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "She has seized everything!" "The men at White's turned their backs on me. Sussex threatened me. She has the entire House of Lords by the throat because her father bought all their promissory notes. We have nothing." The color drained from Clara's beautiful face. The romantic fantasy of being a powerful duke's cherished mistress dissolved in an instant, replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of debtor's prison and social starvation. She looked at the man she had believed to be a titan, now weeping on her sofa, and felt nothing but a rising tide of panic and disgust. Before Clara could utter a word of reproach, a heavy, rhythmic pounding echoed from the front door downstairs. It was not the polite knock of a society caller. It was the blunt, forceful strike of authority. Voices clamored in the foyer, and heavy boots pounded up the carpeted stairs. The drawing-room doors were thrown open, and 3 large men in the thick utilitarian coats of the Bow Street runners strode into the room. Behind them stood the same gray-haired solicitor who had evicted Alistair from his home hours earlier. "Miss Clara Pembroke?" the solicitor asked, his voice dripping with icy formality. Clara stood up, her hand instinctively flying to her throat, covering the sapphire. "How dare you intrude upon my home? I am under the protection of the Duke of Wycliffe." The solicitor did not even look at Alistair. He kept his gaze locked on Clara. "This house is leased under the name of Mr. Alistair Montgomery, whose assets have been seized to satisfy outstanding debts. Therefore, the lease is terminated. You have until nightfall to vacate. However, that is a secondary matter. I am here, on behalf of the Crown and the Hemsley estate." The solicitor pointed a long, bony finger at Clara's neck. "You are in possession of the Wycliffe sapphire. It is a documented historical artifact entrusted by the King to the Duchess of Wycliffe. Lady Genevieve Montgomery is the sole legal custodian." of that jewel. You are wearing stolen property of the highest magnitude. He gave it to me! Clara shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Alistair, who was staring at the floor in a state of catatonic shock. Alistair placed it on my neck. Alistair Montgomery had no legal right to remove it from the family vault, let alone gift it to a mistress, the solicitor stated flatly. He gestured to the Bow Street runners. Remove the stolen property. One of the burly officers stepped forward. Clara backed away, tears streaming down her face, screaming for Alistair to do something, to defend her honor. But the Duke remained frozen on the chaise lounge, completely broken. The officer reached out, his rough, calloused hands unceremoniously unfastening the delicate diamond clasp at the nape of her neck. The sapphire slipped from her skin. Clara felt a phantom coldness where it had rested. The heavy jewel was carefully placed into a black velvet pouch held by the solicitor. Furthermore, Miss Pembroke, the solicitor continued, his tone devoid of pity, Lady Sarah Villiers, the Countess of Jersey, and Princess Leven have officially crossed your name from the vouchers of Almack's. Your father's minor credit lines with the Hemsley banks have also been suspended. Good day. As the men left, the silence in the drawing room was deafening. Clara looked at Alistair, the man who was supposed to be her ticket to the highest echelons of power. She realized, with a sickening drop in her stomach, that she was not just ruined, she was a pariah. By choosing the Duke, she had actively participated in the public humiliation of the most dangerous woman in England. And Genevieve had not merely slapped her down, she had dismantled Clara's entire existence without ever raising her voice. News of the Duke's sudden, spectacular downfall spread through London faster than a cholera outbreak. By the following Tuesday, the social landscape of the empire had been fundamentally altered. High society, a beast that usually thrived on tearing down women, had made a collective, terrifying pivot. They did not rally around the fallen Duke. They bowed, with a newfound, breathless reverence, to the Duchess. Genevieve had not retreated from the public eye. Instead, she established her court. She moved into the grandest suite of the newly reclaimed Wycliffe Manor in Mayfair, throwing open its doors to a highly selective array of guests. Invitations to her morning salons became more coveted than an audience with the Prince Regent himself. The power dynamic was unmistakable. To be seen in Genevieve's drawing room was to be safe from financial ruin. Meanwhile, Alistair had descended into absolute squalor. Desperate, he had taken a cheap room in a dismal boarding house in Cheapside. He spent his days frantically drafting letters to lawyers, barristers, and ancient family friends, begging for a legal injunction against his wife. He argued that under coverture laws, a wife's property belonged to her husband. But Genevieve's father had been a genius of legal architecture. He had established a labyrinthine network of blind trusts and independent holding companies based in international waters and Scottish jurisdictions, entirely bypassing English coverture. No barrister in London was willing to take Alistair's case, not only because it was legally unwinnable, but because taking the case meant declaring war on the Hemsley banking empire. And no man wanted to look across the courtroom and realize his own mortgage was held by the opposition. Driven to the brink of madness, Alistair decided on a final, desperate gamble. He would appeal directly to the Crown. On a rainy Thursday evening, the Prince Regent was hosting a lavish gala at Carlton House. The guest list was restricted to the absolute apex of the British nobility. Alistair, knowing he was no longer welcome, used his knowledge of the servants' entrances and a handful of stolen silver coins to bribe a kitchen boy, slipping into the palace. He waited in the shadows of the crimson drawing room, his clothes rumpled, his hair unkempt, smelling of cheap gin and desperation. He knew the Prince Regent would pass through this corridor on his way to the main dining hall. Alistair believed that if he could just speak to the future king, he could appeal to the solidarity of men. George IV despised his own wife. Surely he would sympathize with a duke terrorized by his. The heavy double doors swung open, and the Prince Regent entered, flanked by his royal guard and the Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool. But walking at the prince's immediate right, draped in silver silk and wearing the reclaimed Wycliffe sapphire, was Lady Genevieve. Alistair's vision went red. He burst from behind the heavy velvet curtains, rushing toward the royal procession. "Your Royal Highness," Alistair bellowed, his voice echoing frantically off the gilded ceilings. I demand justice. This woman has committed treason against the natural order of marriage. The royal guards immediately drew their swords, stepping in front of the prince. But it was not the guards that stopped Alistair in his tracks. It was the reaction of the nobility. Dozens of lords, dukes, and earls who had been trailing behind the prince suddenly surged forward. They did not attack Alistair. They simply formed a solid, impenetrable human wall between him and Genevieve. Lord Castlereagh, the Foreign Secretary, stood shoulder to shoulder with the Duke of Devonshire. Men of immense power and pride, men who had previously humored Alistair's arrogance, now stood as a physical barricade, protecting the Duchess. The Prince Regent peered over the shoulders of his lords, looking at Alistair with profound distaste. He then turned his gaze to Genevieve, who stood perfectly still, her face an unreadable mask of absolute calm. "My dear Duchess," the Prince Regent drawled, his voice carrying clearly in the dead silence of the room. "Do you know this vagrant? It was the ultimate, crushing blow. The future King of England was publicly denying the existence of the Duke of Wycliffe, erasing his status with a single sentence." Genevieve looked past the wall of powerful men, her eyes meeting Alistair's. For a fleeting second, Alistair saw the memory of the woman he had wed, the hopeful heiress who had saved his family. But that woman was dead, murdered by years of his own cruelty. In her place stood a titan. Genevieve's lips curved into that same terrifyingly serene smile she had worn at the ball. "I am afraid I do not, Your Highness," Genevieve replied smoothly, her voice like liquid silver. "He appears to be a man who played a dangerous game and lost everything." The Prince Regent nodded approvingly. "Guards," he commanded lazily, "remove this intruder from my palace. Throw him into the Fleet prison for trespassing." As the guards seized Alistair's arms, dragging him backward, he did not scream. The fight had finally been bled out of him. He stared in hollow horror as the Prime Minister offered Genevieve his arm, and the entire royal procession moved past him without a second glance. Alistair realized then the true scale of his folly. He had thought power was a title, a lineage, and a sapphire necklace. But true power was the silent machinery of consequence. He had chosen his mistress to prove his dominance, believing the world would laugh with him. Instead, he watched as the heavy doors of Carlton House closed, sealing him out of society forever. Hours after he had chosen Clara, the entire kingdom had made its choice. And they had chosen the Duchess. The Fleet prison was a wretched, festering monument to London's failures. Situated on the noxious banks of the River Fleet, it was a purgatory of damp stone, rotting straw, and the ceaseless groans of forgotten men. It was here, amongst pickpockets, disgraced merchants, and destitute gamblers, that Alistair Montgomery, the former Duke of Wycliffe, spent his first winter of ruin. His velvet coat had long since been traded to a cruel warden for a frayed woolen blanket and extra rations of hardened bread. The aristocratic arrogance that had once defined his sharp features had melted away, leaving a gaunt, haunted shell of a man. Every time the heavy iron gates of the ward clattered open, Alistair would jolt up, desperately expecting a solicitor bearing news of a royal pardon, or perhaps a sudden, miraculous reversal of the courts. But salvation never came. The society that had once toasted his name had eradicated him from their collective memory with terrifying efficiency. 4 months into his imprisonment, Alistair received his first and only visitor. The heavy iron door of the visiting parlor groaned on its hinges. Alistair squinted through the gloom, his heart leaping into his throat as a woman in a dark traveling cloak stepped into the dimly lit room. For a brief, deluded second, he thought Genevieve had come to forgive him. But as the woman lowered her hood, the musty air seemed to grow even colder. It was Clara Pembroke. She was no longer the glowing, ambitious beauty who had paraded through the summer solstice ball. Her cheeks were hollow, her porcelain skin pallid, and her dress, once the height of Parisian fashion, was mended at the seams and stained with city mud. "Clara," Alistair rasped, shuffling toward the wooden partition that separated them. "You came. You must have spoken to your father. Can he secure my release?" A small loan is all I require to hire a decent barrister. My father is dead, Hallister, Clara interrupted, her voice devoid of any affection, dripping instead with a venomous bitterness. He died of apoplexy 3 weeks after your wife ruined us. His minor debts were called in by the Hemsley Bank, just like yours. Our modest estate was liquidated. I am living in a miserable room above a fishmonger in Covent Garden, sewing hems for a penny a yard. Alistair stared at her, stunned. Then, why are you here? Clara leaned close to the iron grate, her eyes blazing with a hatred so profound it made Alistair flinch. I came to look at you. I came to see the arrogant fool who destroyed my life. You promised me the world, Alistair. You promised me power, wealth, and a title. Instead, you made me the target of the most dangerous woman in the British Empire. Because of you, I am a ghost. Men cross the street to avoid me, lest they offend the Duchess. You have condemned me to the gutters. We are victims of her madness, Clara, Alistair pleaded, reaching a filthy hand toward the grate. We must stand together! Clara let out a harsh, broken laugh. We are not victims of her madness. We are victims of her genius, and you are a victim of your own boundless stupidity. She pulled her cloak tight around her thin shoulders. Rot in this cell, Alistair. I hope the memory of that sapphire haunts you until the day you die. Clara turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving Alistair entirely alone in the suffocating silence. While Alistair withered in the dark, Genevieve's ascension reached stratospheric heights. As the year turned to 1815, the shadow of Napoleon Bonaparte once again loomed over Europe. The British government found itself in desperate need of immediate, massive capital to fund Lord Wellington's impending military campaigns on the continent. The Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, did not turn to the Bank of England alone. He came directly to the drawing room of Wycliffe Manor. In a landmark, completely classified agreement, Genevieve personally underwrote a staggering percentage of the British military expenditures. In exchange, she was granted silent, unprecedented leverage over the nation's trade routes and international tariffs. She was no longer just a wealthy duchess. She was a sovereign power operating behind the velvet curtains of Mayfair. She had become the very architecture of the empire's economy. It was in the spring of 1815, shortly before the Battle of Waterloo, that Genevieve decided to close the final chapter of her past. Lord Henry Fitzroy, her trusted shadow governor, arrived at the Fleet prison, carrying a thick, leather-bound ledger. He paid the warden handsomely to unlock Alistair's cell, stepping inside with a handkerchief pressed lightly to his nose to ward off the stench of decay. Alistair looked up from the damp floor, his eyes wide and feverish. Fitzroy, you have come to gloat. I have come to grant you clarity, Alistair, Fitzroy said softly, setting a small wooden stool down and opening the ledger. Lady Genevieve felt you deserved to understand the true nature of your defeat. Alistair sneered, though he lacked the energy to make it threatening. I understand perfectly. She used my affair with Clara Pembroke to trigger the morality clause in the marriage settlement. She waited for a mistake. Fitzroy offered a slow, pitying shake of his head. You still underestimate her. She did not wait for a mistake, Alistair. She engineered it. Alistair froze. What? Do you truly believe Miss Pembroke suddenly, out of nowhere, began demanding to wear the Wycliffe sapphire? Fitzroy asked, his eyes gleaming with a cold intellect. Lady Genevieve spent 3 years carefully laying the groundwork for your destruction. She knew your ego was your singular weakness. It was Genevieve's agents who subtly planted the idea of the sapphire in Clara's social circles. It was Genevieve who ensured rumors reached Clara that the sapphire was the ultimate proof of a duke's devotion. Genevieve knew that if Clara pressured you enough, your vanity would override your common sense. Alistair's breath hitched in his chest. The walls of the tiny cell seemed to close in on him. She handed you the rope, Fitzroy continued mercilessly. But she did not force you to put it around your neck. You chose to parade your mistress. You chose to steal the heirloom. You practically sprinted into the trap she had laid. entirely blind to the fact that she had been weaving the net for years. Every debt she purchased, every alliance she forged, was done while you were busy drinking and boasting. Fitzroy pulled a crisp, white document from the ledger and dropped it onto the dirty straw at Alistair's feet. These are the final annulment papers, signed by the Archbishop of Canterbury himself. The Crown has scrubbed your name from the peerage. You are legally no one. You will remain in this prison until your death. And Lady Genevieve, well, Lady Genevieve owns the world. Fitzroy turned and walked out of the cell. The heavy iron door slammed shut, the metallic boom echoing like a final cannon shot in the dark. Alistair Montgomery collapsed into the rotting straw, staring at the white document in the gloom, finally realizing the horrifying truth. He had never been the master of his house, his wife, or his fate. He had only ever been a pawn, entirely outplayed by a queen. Genevieve's brilliant revenge proves that true power never needs to shout. When a brilliant woman is deeply underestimated, she doesn't just level the playing field, she buys the entire board. Alistair traded his grand empire for a fleeting moment of ego, and he paid the ultimate price. If you were captivated by this thrilling tale of historical vengeance and high society justice, please hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more stories.